In this video, I'm going to have a look at the basic watercolor techniques using the tools and actions that you can download here. Most of these tools and techniques I've developed myself, but I do have to give credit to people like Zoe Peel who've already published a lot of information on using Photoshop for painting watercolors, and certainly some of the techniques that I've got here are developments of these techniques. So the first thing we're going to do is to close this document, and we're going to open a new document or create a new document. And what I normally do is to use a preset to make things a bit quicker, but the important thing is to set the resolution to 150 pixels per inch, and also the color profile to ProPhoto RGB if you intend to use this color swatch here. The dimensions of the painting can be whatever you want, but they should be at the size that you intend to print or display. We now have a white background, and what we need to do is to run an action to set up the watercolor layers before painting. Just to show you what's happening, I'm going to drag the layers palette out here, and I'm now going to run the make watercolor paper action here. And if you look at the left, you'll see what's happening. So the background has been changed to background locked. It also contains a paper texture, and there's a new layer group here called paper overlay, which also contains a paper texture here, and this layer here gives texture to the paint. This layer here gives texture to the rest of the painting. Both layers are locked, as you can see, but if you wish to change the texture of the paint or the painting, you can simply unlock and increase or decrease the opacity as you wish, and then don't forget to lock it again to prevent you from painting on the layer by mistake. We should normally paint at print size, and once we set it to print size, you can see that you can see the paper texture. Now you'll also notice that a brush has been selected here, and if we pick a color like a pale yellow, you'll also notice the opacity of the brush has been set to a low value of about 20%. And the reason for that is that when we paint in watercolors, very often we build up colors gradually, one on top of the other. But of course you can simply go along and change the opacity to whatever you want. So when we're painting here, we're painting on the watercolor layer, and if I just apply a little bit of yellow to it like this, and then let's say I pick a different color like for example Windsor Red Deep, and let me increase the opacity a bit, maybe to 50%, to get more color like this. Well, what we're simulating here is putting wet paint over wet paint in traditional painting. But of course, in traditional painting with paint and paper, the paint will flow into the paint, so the alizarin crimson will flow into the yellow here. And this of course is not happening in Photoshop. To simulate the flowing of the paint, what we do is to pick one of our tools, and one of the smudge tools or blenders, and what I'll do is just pick the basic smudge tool here, and you see that this tool has currently a default strength of 81%. So let's see what it does here. Well, you can see that it's kind of making the paint flow quite well into this. Now, But what I can do is I can reduce or increase the strength. So let's say if I drop the strength to, let's say, 30%, again I can simply press the 3 to get 30%, and then go like this. I'm getting a much gentler blending effect. If I can also increase the strength to 100%, say, and what I then get is a different kind of running effect like this. Not sure how well you can see that. And of course we can use the smudge tool on the edges too, so that we're now getting the effect of the paint running, into the paper. Now, another very common effect in watercolor painting is to allow the paint to dry and then to paint over the dry paint, and that's called wet on dry. So in order to achieve this in Photoshop, what we do is we need to create a new layer, and what we do is we run this action, new watercolor layer, and you can see that what it's done is it's created this new empty layer. There's nothing in there at all. It's set its mode to multiply, and it's put it above the original layer, which is where we have our paint. If I now paint again with exactly the same color over the existing paint, what you can see is we get this quite different effect of the new paint is now looks quite translucent. You can see the yellow underneath, and instead of getting a kind of a mixture like this here, we're getting a nice kind of orangey color as the two colors overlap. If we now pick another color, or not, as the case may be, but let's say cobalt blue deep, and if I now paint over this alizarin crimson that I put down here on this layer, I'm back again to the wet on wet for this layer. So this is wet paint going over the wet paint. However, if I paint over here, I am now painting wet over dry, because if I take these layers off, you can see that all of these are in fact overlaying, and so the effect is that if you paint on a different layer, it's wet on dry. If you paint on the same layer, it's wet on wet, and you can see the difference in translucency there between these. Again, we can select one of our smudge tools and we can smudge the paint, but we're not mixing the paints as we did when they were on the same layer. However, here, because they're on the same layer, the mixing is going to be, of the two paints, the same colors. So when you're painting like this, you need to remember what paint is on what layer. But you can see, I'll make this a bit bigger already, that we're getting a kind of a, not a bad sort of watercolor effect there. I can always go back to this layer and blend this a bit more if I wanted, for example. Now, when we're happy with what we've done, our little painting, or if we've gone far enough with this little bit of the painting, and what we can then do is we can merge these layers, and what we do is we use another action here, which is called merge layers. So we click on that, it's taken both layers and it's made them into one. So that's essentially the process. We paint on one layer for wet on wet, add a new layer for wet on dry, pick a different color, possibly. Oh, I've got the smudge tool selected. Go back to the brush tool, do some painting, possibly some smudging or blending, like that, so we get a nice little effect. Maybe the brush again, pick a different color, possibly blend again a bit. Let's say we reduce the opacity to maybe 30% this time to get a more gentle effect, and so on. Now we're happy with that. We can go to our actions and merge the layers, and we're back down to a single layer again. Another effect I'd like to demonstrate is what happens in watercolors when you put wet paint over dry paper. And so I'm just going to put a bit of paint down like this. Slightly varying opacity just for the hell of it. And what should really be happening here is that around the edges there should be a darker fringe. And the reason for that is the paint should be flowing out and then gathering around the edges and causing this darker area. Well, to simulate that, what we do is we run the Make Edges action. And I think you can probably see there that there's a darker edge around the blob. And what it's done is it's created this new layer called Edges with the opacity set to 50%. Now if I increase the opacity, you can see that you get a much stronger edge, reduce it, and it goes down. So one of the nice things about this is that the edge, or you can turn it off or turn it back on again. It's a non-destructive technique, and it's very, very easy to modify it. So for example, we could pick our Smudge Tool and let's put the opacity down something quite low, like 20%. And on the Edges layer itself, what I'm going to do is run the Smudge Tool like that. And you can see that although it's left the edge everywhere else, it's removed the edge here. And what we can also do then is go down to the layer underneath, and if we want to get this paint to flow into the paper a bit, we can do that. So what we have now is a situation where we've got the edges here, and we've got paint that's bled out onto the paper over here. Once we're happy with that, we can then merge this layer with this one. Again, we simply run the Merge Layers command, and we're back down to a single layer. Again, if we wish to do some more blending, we can do it on this layer here. So I can then end up with a very nice soft situation here where the paint has bled into the paper, and the reason for that is because we had actually wet this paper before, unknowing to us, but here in fact the paper was dry, so we got an edge. Well, so far we've used one brush, we've used one way of making edges, and looked a little bit at using layers. What I'm going to do now is just have a bit more of a look at the different things that we can do. And first of all, as we've already looked at actions a bit, I'll just go through the standard set of actions that you get with these tools. Well, we've already seen the Make Watercolor Paper. You've also got a Make HP Watercolor Paper action, and that creates a hot press paper or a very smooth paper. We have the new Watercolor Layer, which we've used already, and the Merge Layers, which we both used. There's also an action here which gives you a new opaque layer, and that's to simulate a kind of acrylic or gouache paint, which is a much more opaque paint, doesn't have the kind of translucency that watercolors do. We've had a look at the Make Edges, and there are two other edges action called Make Edges Strong and Make Pooling. And Make Edges Strong is simply a stronger version of Make Edges. Make Pooling is to simulate the effect of water running down and pooling at the bottom, so you get a much thicker, broader edge, darker edge. We'll have a look at these in much more detail later on. Then up here we've got two scratch brushes and a grain brush. And the scratch brushes are to simulate paint scratching, which we can do with ordinary paper or on paper using something like a penknife or a nail or a sandpaper or anything that scratches the paint off the paper. So the scratch brush gives little this kind of stuff here, and the scratch line brush is more this sort of thing here. And the grain brush then gives you a kind of grain effect, and there are quite a few different ways of creating grain, but essentially what grain is when the paint pools into the hollows of the paper, so you get darker bits and lighter bits around it. One thing I'd like to point out is that again all of these create new layers, and because of that it's completely non-destructive. You can delete the layers, you can modify them, you can soften them, you can do whatever you want. So let's have a look at the last one here, which is a make watermark layer. And again, as you can see, it's created a new layer. And if we do this, we can see that this is kind of the effect of a drop of water falling on dry or semi-dry paint. So it pulls out like that, drags the paint out, and creates an edge with it. The last two brushes here are just brushes that can be used to make masks, because masks are quite a very useful thing in Photoshop. It's one of the advantages of digital that you can use things like masks to contain areas of your painting more easily than you can on traditional media. Although of course you can also do that on traditional media, using things like masking fluid, or even by wetting an area of the paper to contain the paint. If I now run one of the make mask actions, we're currently on the watermarks layer. Let's say I run the make mask with a hard brush, and if you just keep an eye here, you can see that what it's done is to create a new mask. It's white. White in Photoshop means that it has no effect. It's also picked a hard brush, this one here, and it's picked a black color, so that if I paint over the watermarks now, it'll simply erase them out. So I can erase bits of it or all of it. If I change the color from black to white, I can bring it back in again. So that's a nice feature of Photoshop. It makes it very, very easy to modify things in that way. Well, that's a quick overview of the actions. The other main feature of the tools are the tool presets. And as you can see, we've got a large number of them. The ones that are used the most probably are all of these wash brushes here. And I suppose one of the questions that one might ask is why so many of them? Well, just as in normal watercolors, part of the reason is that some of them are broader, some of them are narrower, some of them are softer. But also in traditional watercolors, we can achieve a lot of effects with just the one brush, and that's more difficult to do in Photoshop. So that's part of the reason for the large number of brushes. But as a very quick example, let's say we pick the wash clean edge, and as you can see, we're getting a flat wash with a very clean edge. And let's say we pick something like the wash soft grainy. Well, we get this kind of look. Or wash fractal grainy, for example. We get this kind of look. So they're very, very different looks to the different brushes. And the important thing really when you're trying these out is literally to play around with them and to get to understand them. A lot of the time, things like the opacity need to be changed. These tend to be very critical things with the brushes. So it's not just a question of trying the brush and saying, well, that's fine, you know, I like the feature, but also you need to, for example, reduce the opacity to something like, let's say, 20% and see what you get. So this brush, this is the same brush at 100%, and at 30%, we get this effect. Very different. So let's just go back then to the first set of brushes. One thing you'll notice is that all of these brushes here are prefixed by DOD, for example. All of these ones by ink, all these ones by MSC, and so on. And that's to make it a little bit easier to select the brushes. And DOD means dry on dry. So for example, if I pick something like a dry bristle brush, I get this sort of look, or dry bristle raggedy, I get something like this, or dry on dry chalk, something like this. So you get this kind of effect of a dry brush on dry paper. The next set of brushes are the ink brushes, and they will typically do things like that, and the things that you may wish to use for Japanese kind of painting, but they are also very useful sometimes in just ordinary watercolor painting. The miscellaneous brushes here, or the MSC, the ones prefixed with MSC, do various things like the scratching that I mentioned before, the grain, salt, wash paint splatters, so something like this, and watermarks that I've already mentioned to you before. So these are the miscellaneous brushes here. We then have a few pencils, and the pencil sketcher in particular is very good for doing sketching. And of course 2B pencil, and the dry wax pencil is quite a nice pencil too for detail work. Then we have the wash brushes I've mentioned to you before, and then below these all of the WD or wet on dry brushes. So the wet on dry brushes, as the name implies, give you the effect of wet paint on dry paper. So for example, something like this, you can see that we don't get the dry on dry effect that we had before. This sort of thing here, or this. Again, it's important to consider the opacity, because if you want a very dark color, then you could do something like this at 100%, or a very light color, maybe at 10%, but they're still giving you a wet on wet look. So there's a whole bunch of these brushes here. And then what I'll do is just move on. These are just the mask brushes for doing masks. And we now come to the two sets of really important brushes, and these are the erasers and the smudge tools. I won't spend too much time on these right now, because they're actually too important, and I'll tackle them separately in another video. But erasers, for example, are not as quite as obvious as one might think. Clearly, we've got things like a hard eraser, which simply will erase like that. But we also have erasers that have this sort of effect. So this is like actually adding water. And if we drop the opacity down to maybe 20% and do it here, you can see that even though it is actually erasing, the effect is much more of one of adding water. And some of these provide texture, some of them are kind of very soft, so we can just kind of leach the color like that. So they're very important. They're all based, by the way, on brushes, and you can also change the opacity, change the flow, and treat them just like you would a normal brush. And then we finally come to the blenders or the smudge tools, and they really make the watercolors possible in Photoshop. Without these, we couldn't do an awful lot. I've showed you already some of the ones, like for example a delicate blender like this. And again, by changing the opacity to something quite low, we can have very, very delicate effects. But there are also ones like the drag one, which literally drag the paint like this. And we can get all kinds of effects with the smudge tools. And simply by doing things like changing the strength or the opacity again, with this very same brush, if I drop that to, let's say, 20%, I get a totally different effect. But there, what's happening, as you can see, is it's kind of moving the paint. Whereas if I increase the opacity to 100%, it's dragging it very strongly like that. So let's say these are very important brushes, and I'll look at them in a lot more detail in a later video. So I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. This gives you a quick overview. There are some additional things like the styles that I haven't mentioned, but we'll cover these in a later video. The most important thing really are understanding how to make the paper, how to use layers, what actions to use to do these various things, and then how to use the tools and which ones to use.